Hey y'all, today we're going to talk about the Big G, some personal details about the indispensable man.
George Washington, a fellow I like to refer to as the Big G, was born in 1732 in Virginia. He actually descended from some big ballin' people, as King Edward III of England, a fellow who was in charge in the 14th century, was one of his ancestors. George Washington's great-grandfather, John Washington, went to the New World in 1656. This was long after Jamestown had been established and had become commercially successful. John wanted to get some tobacco, take it back to England, sell that stinky weed, and make some dough. However, on his way back, his ship ran into some problems and he had to turn around or drown, and he ended up settling in the area, marrying a lady named Anna. If you can't get back to England, you might as well stay in the New World. George Washington's father was named Augustine Washington, though his friends called him Gus. Gus married a lady named Jane, and they started to establish a plantation, which ended up being called Ferry Farm. But Jane died, as women often did in this time period, and by 1732, Gus had hooked up with another lady and married her. Her name was Mary. Mary Ball Washington has her own tale of woe. Her father died when she was a toddler, and then her mother died as well when she was just 12. She ended up being overseen by a guardian, a lawyer who had been friends with her mother. His name was George Eskridge. It is probably from this fellow that George Washington gets his name. The interesting thing about Mary Ball Washington, George's mom, is that even though she has this backstory that is very sad, she and her son, her oldest son George, are not going to always get along. And in fact, she will serve as a source of embarrassment for him later when he has command of troops, because she will often poor mouth, even though she is never really poor, and she will say that she needs things like more servants, more money, more provisions, whatever, while George is out there fighting people like, I don't know, the British. George Washington probably felt some extra duty towards his mother because his father died when he was just 11. Having said that, he does have male role models in his life, and he absolutely idolizes his older half brother, whose name was Lawrence. Lawrence Washington was 14 years older than George Washington, and he's going to serve as not just the coolest big brother ever, but a type of surrogate dad. He will take George under his wing and try to give him direction. He will even get him a commission in the British Navy when George is just 14. But Mary says, you want my son to get on a ship and sail away? No thank you. That's not happening. Here, by the way, I totally agree with Mary. 14? That was pretty normal back then, though. George Washington did have a basic education in Virginia, but he did not go to university. So once his Navy career was given the kibosh, he had to figure out something else to do. At the age of 16, he moved over from his father's old estate, where his mother resided, to his brother's estate. That estate was called Mount Vernon. George was good at math, and he focused on learning how to become a land surveyor. Unfortunately, Lawrence Washington came down with tuberculosis, and this creates a crisis for the family. So Lawrence, taking George Washington in tow, relocated to Barbados with the hopes that the weather would help him out. While in Barbados, George Washington ends up catching smallpox, which in the 1700s was devastating. He almost died, but he did obviously recover. Lawrence Washington did not. He died of TB, and George Washington ended up inheriting his estate of Mount Vernon in 1752. Washington also came to majority and got his inheritance from his father's estate, and he used what he had to improve the lands on which he lived. You might wonder what George Washington looked like in his 20s, and reportedly he was pretty handsome. He was over 6 feet tall. He was very athletic. He was an incredible equestrian. He had reddish brown hair, which he would pull back per the style of the day. And later on in life, he'd end up powdering it white. We always think about him with the white hair because those are the portraits that you see. He had many fascinations with young women, but it appears that he often struck out with the ladies. We know there were overtures to Betsy, a Mary, and a Sally before Martha finally said yes to the dress. Martha Dandridge Custis was in her late 20s when she ended up hooking up with George. She was a widow, and this is something that made her more attractive to Washington. What? Well, she was the richest widow in the entire county, and George Washington was always looking at increasing his standing and expanding his estate. And by making a good match, you could do that. Whether George had ulterior motives or not, this match seems to have been a good one.
George ended up adopting Martha's 2 surviving children from her previous marriage, and even though he doesn't have any biological issue of his own, they are a happy family. None of that means that there were never any problems. People have problems. People always have problems. Families always have problems. Martha's son, Jack Custis, made some bad decisions in his 20s and ended up running into some financial issues. He died at Yorktown, and George and Martha ended up adopting several of his children and raising them at Mount Vernon. This has been a pretty general overview of George Washington's personal life. I just wanted to give you some of the details because occasionally when we think about George Washington, we see the father of the nation, and he seems not human. He was. I hope you learned something new. Bye.